Welcome to this week's episode of Forgiving the Girl Inside, a matter of the heart. I'm your hostess, Drennon, energetic mindset mentor. And today we have the beautiful Terri Kozlowski with us. She is a certified life coach, blogger, author of Transcending Fear, and founder of Soul Solutions. Love that name. She specializes in empowering women by teaching them to set personal boundaries, reframe the stories they tell themselves, overcome their fears, and push past their limiting beliefs. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here, for sharing your time with us. So tell us a little bit about your background, what life was like before you started this transformation journey, this soul journey that you've been on.
Well, Lisa, thank you very much for having me and letting me share with your audience today. My background is a sad trauma story. And I believe that all of us are when we come into this world, we come in as very aware. We know exactly who we are. We know what it is we're supposed to do with this in this life. We come in wanting to love and be loved by everybody because that's all we know. That's what we come here knowing. And then we get introduced to the first unknown in our lives, which is our family. And some of us have fabulous families and some of us have not so fabulous families. And I had a split. I had a really great father and his parents were fabulous. And then my mother was the exact opposite. She was everything that you don't want in a mother. She was an alcoholic. She was a drug addict. She allowed on a visit after my parents divorced, my dad got custody. She allowed 3 men to sexually assault me while she watched so she could have drugs for free. And then she disappeared for 3 days. And when she returned, she packed up our suitcases and put them out on the front stoop and told us it was time to go home, and did not help us get home at all. She literally abandoned us. And we walked a mile to her friend's house to make a phone call to my dad to let him know it was time for us to come home. So that very sad, traumatic event in my life completely altered and changed who I thought I was. And again, this was something in my head, not necessarily something on the outside. And for me, that awareness to get me back home safely. And then I had continual awareness because when I got off the airplane to see my dad, I told him I needed therapy. Now, this was back in 1980, where 11-year-olds should know what therapy is. And then I spent from the time I was 11 until I was 18 in therapy, and they didn't quite know what to do with me. And what I mean by that is child sexual abuse wasn't talked about at that point in time. And certainly I wasn't going to say this happened to me because I was 11. I wasn't quite sure what happened to me. I knew that it was wrong. I knew it wasn't my fault. And I knew it was something I couldn't handle. But that's all I knew. And that was the awareness that I still had left over that we all come in with. But as we go through trauma, that awareness kind of gets shut down because our defense mechanisms take over. Our ego, whose job it is to protect us, that comes in really hard to do everything it can to protect us. And the ego protects us by using fear. And I became fearful of everything, absolutely everything. Family was fearful. Because if you cannot trust your mother to take care of you and protect you, who can you trust? Yeah. So fear became how I lived my life.
Wow. And it's and I think of all the stories that I've heard, that one just like put a pit in my stomach, and just like the pain, just seeing yourself as an 11-year-old going through that. I was sexually molested by a family member from like age 3 to 7. And like you said, I didn't know it wasn't wrong. I didn't really know how to deal with it. Had no idea how it was going to affect my life. But, 11-year-olds are pretty smart, and they're at that age where they're, they're going into the puberty, they're developing, and they're you see a lot. And to be in that situation and yeah, your own mom, and wow. So this inner strength that you had to know, like, I'm directionally challenged. As an 11-year-old, you walked a mile to somebody's house. Like, how did you even know what direction to go in? I would have just been, I'm not good. I freeze. I'm not, the fight, flight, or freeze. I definitely freeze in tragedy.
Okay. And I'm the exact opposite. I fight. Okay. So,
Okay.
and I don't know where that inner fight came from, except for the fact that the last thing my dad said to me before we went on this trip was to take care of my baby sister. Now, my baby sister is 11 months to the day younger than I am. So we are, it's like twin-like. We looked alike, we dressed alike, and everybody assumed we were twins. But the reality is that statement saved not only me, but my sister, because something in me snapped. And in that snap, I was, okay, I have to take care of her. What do I need to do? Well, we have to figure out a way to call my dad. Now, we talked about going to the police because that's what, that was something we thought we could do. And at the same time, we didn't want to go to the police because that would put my mom in danger. That would get her in trouble. So there was where the codependency kicked in at a very young age, because my mother had been an alcoholic prior to my parents divorcing. So most of my young life, she was an alcoholic. Actually, she was an alcoholic before she married my dad. So those codependent behaviors kicked in, and you don't want mom to get in trouble. Even though all this happened, you still protect your mother. That's that codependency. And so we didn't go to the police. And the only thing we could do was walk to that friend's house. Now, over the course of the time that we were there, she was sober when we got there, and she was sober for about 2 weeks. And then she started the drinking again. And when we had a routine, when she got her paycheck, we would walk to the grocery store. Now, the grocery store was a quarter mile away, actually, probably more like a half mile. And we'd go ahead and buy the groceries. We get a money order for the weekly efficiency apartment rent. And then we would, go back and keep living. So there was this routine, and I knew this friend's house was past the grocery store because we had walked there previously, because my mother didn't have a car. So it wasn't that it was unfamiliar. It was just something, it's something we did. Now, we were carrying suitcases, and you would think that if you saw two girls, 11 and 10, carrying suitcases on the streets of Albuquerque, New Mexico, walking a mile, you may stop and wonder what's going on. Mm-hmm. Nobody stopped us. Nobody asked us any questions. That also tells you the kind of neighborhood it was. This was not a very good neighborhood to be in. And because of that, I am blessed that we got to where we needed to go without incident. And, they had a phone, and we could make the phone call to my dad. So, it's those things that occur and don't occur when your awareness is, I have a mission. I'm trying to get my sister and I home. Now, I called my dad, and he couldn't get us out until the next morning on an airplane. And he asked me if we had a ride to the airport because my mother's friend also didn't have a car. And I said yes. And when my mother picked us up, when we arrived, she had a friend with her. His name was Alan. I have no idea what his last name was. He had a cowboy hat and cowboy boots on, and I thought he looked really cool. Alan was a nuclear physicist at Los Alamos, and have no idea how in the world he knew my mother, who was an alcoholic. And he took us up to Sandias Peak, which has a fabulous restaurant up the tram. We spent the afternoon with him. And when he took us back to my mother's 1-bedroom efficiency apartment, he handed me a business card. Now, I'm 11. I don't know what a business card is. He handed me the business card, and he said, if you need anything at all, you call me. So when all this happened and I said I had a ride, I got off the phone with my dad and I got that business card. Now, something in me told me to keep it. So I slipped it into a pocket on the suitcase. And I called him, and he showed up the next day, an hour before he needed to. He walked my sister and I onto that airplane, never heard of Alan again. He was an angel sent to get my sister and I out of that place at a time that we needed. Have no idea who he was, except I'm very grateful that Alan came into my life for the brief time he did.
Wow, I'm crying here.
Again, wow. Those are those.
That is so powerful.
It is when you are aware enough to understand that people come in and out of your life for a reason. Mm-hmm. And even if you have no idea what that reason is, and somebody hands you their business card, take it. You don't know what it means in your future. And we are all meant to make these one-on-one connections with people. And whether we're teaching them or they're teaching us, or we're helping them or they're helping us, there is a purpose for all of us to interact with one another.
Absolutely. Yes. Wow. That's such a powerful story. Yeah. Anyways, as you started saying that, I'm like, okay, now this has got to be an angel, because you didn't know him, and then you did this, and then who hands an 11-year-old a business card? Like, no one does that. You just don't even think about that. And wow, so powerful. So what was your pivot point? Like what, I mean, obviously strong character, amazing leadership, and just totally caring for your sister and yourself. And I'm just speechless. I'm not even quite sure what. Wow. So what made you want to do what you're doing? I know you wrote the book, it's behind you. Raven. Why a raven? Why did you choose Raven?
Okay, so Raven Transcending Fear is my teaching memoir about how I overcame child sexual trauma and the abandonment of my mother, went through the fear process because I lived every day in fear. And when you live from a place of fear, the choices you make are not always the best choices. The choices you make come from this place of utter scarcity and worry and agony, so that you are no longer in pain. And yet the longer you live from this place of fear, the longer you stay in your pain and suffering, because you're stuck, you're trapped, and your egoic mind keeps you in that fearful state so that you don't get hurt, but you also don't ever grow. You don't ever learn to overcome. You stay trapped in that fear. You stay trapped in that past. You stay trapped in depression, because I went into a depression, of course. And when I made that pivot, it didn't occur until I was in college. And it happened early. My first semester in college, I was 17 years old, and I went to lunch, and I was very vocal about I had a traumatic event. Now, I didn't always tell you what the world that was, but I would let you know that something bad happened to me because I had triggers, and my triggers were not necessarily normal. I just cried or anything. If you came up behind me and touched me, I came around swinging, because nobody was allowed to touch me. And so I knew I had these strong triggers, and I didn't want to harm anybody, because that was definitely my reaction, not necessarily their fault for doing anything. So I was vocal about I had a trauma, and I was having lunch with a friend, and he turned to me and he said, "Well, you like being a victim." That was, I had a very angry reaction to it, because who are you to tell me anything about my victimhood? But then something about it stuck with me, because he didn't say it out of malice. He wasn't trying to poke at me or get a reaction out of me. He was sincerely trying to give me an alternate way of looking at something. So I sat with that. I journaled about it, and I finally realized, yes, I was getting something out of it. And the one thing I wanted everybody to do was leave me alone. And when you are a victim, people treat you differently, especially when you tell them you're a victim. I had trauma. And what do people do? When you hear somebody tell you had trauma, you react to them completely different. Your response to them is out of kindness and compassion and empathy. Or when you're teenagers and you have no idea what the heck that means, you've had a traumatic event, you leave them the hell alone. You just leave them alone. And that is exactly what I wanted. I wanted to be left alone. And being in victimhood allowed me to be left alone. Now, as I was in college, I realized there had to be a better way to communicate this. So I pivoted away from being a victim and decided to become a survivor. And when I did that, two things happened. Number one, I now became responsible for all the choices that I made moving forward. And what I mean by that is, even if I made a poor choice, I couldn't blame it on my mother. I couldn't blame it on the trauma. I couldn't blame it on the 3 men who molested me. I had to take responsibility for the choices and the decisions I was making today. And when you take responsibility, a second empowering thing happens, and you empower yourself to take control and move forward in your life. And most trauma victims stay stuck because they feel empowered to do anything. But when they take responsibility for the decisions and choices they make, they regain that control and say, Mom, you don't have power over my present or my future. You don't have power over how I move forward in my life. I now make those decisions, even if they're bad ones. I make those decisions. And in that transition from victim to survivor, the empowerment really is the one thing trauma survivors are looking for, is feeling that control, regaining that power within themselves to move forward and make decisions for themselves.
That's beautiful. Yes, the power within, the power of choice, the power of protection, and and not giving that person the power to overcome your thoughts and dictate your actions.
Absolutely.
Such a beautiful story. I'm looking forward to reading it. Were there any other modalities that you implemented that helped you on this journey that you've been on?
So, of course, I mentioned the journaling, and journaling really is about getting clarity, not only of what you're thinking, but also getting the emotions out, especially the negative ones. Because for females, especially, little girls are told to be nice and, play nice, and, you don't want to upset anybody. And we get all this messaging about how we're supposed to act in the world. And yet when we're angry and frustrated and in pain, nobody teaches us how to release those. So journaling is a fabulous tool to be able to release that in a safe place. Nobody gets hurt except maybe the pencil gets broken, or, your paper gets scratched up because you were writing so hard. But other than that, it's a very safe place for you to put all that negativity down into. And you have to get that negativity out so that you can keep moving on your healing journey. So over the years, especially later in life, I learned meditation. But the main tool that I think that I implemented early on was what I didn't realize there was a name for it. And I started talking about reframing. And what I meant by that is exactly what the psychological term means, is taking your experiences and reframing it in a way that empowers you instead of disempowers you. So although, yes, I was molested, that event happened one time. It happened over 40 years ago. So why is that one event still having negative impacts on my present and my future? So for me, reframing is about seeing the lesson I am to learn. So yes, you made comments about what positive things came out of that 11-year-old experience. You talked about leadership. You talked about caring for my sister. So these were awareness. You actually saw these, except it took me much, much longer to see them. And that's the other thing about going through our healing journey, is realizing and becoming aware of those lessons that we're to learn. When we look back, what do we actually see? Of course, our ego immediately sees the negativity, it immediately sees the pain, it immediately sees all the suffering that we went through. But think about it. If the event only happened once for me, then my suffering from that event all occurred here. And that is where it replays. And that's part of the problem of any trauma, is that it replays over and over and over again. My mother's voice, I did not really have much communication with my mother over the past 40 years. We just didn't communicate very often. And when we did, it for a while there, I didn't have personal boundaries in place, and she would rant and rave and blame me for everything because she was drunk. And I would sit there on the phone and listen to it because I didn't have a personal boundary in place to say, you know what, you don't get to hurt me anymore. Because I kept thinking I needed to honor my mother. And honoring someone does not mean you allow them to hurt you. Doesn't matter if it's a parent. It doesn't matter if it's a grandparent or a family member. You don't honor them by allowing them to hurt you. And I was 25 before I realized that, and 28 before I actually started trying to put boundaries in place with my mother. And we weren't physically together. We were physically together 3 times after I was 11. When I got married at 21, when my son was born at 23, and then in 1996 was the last time I saw her. So, but there's, her tape was playing in my head. I was 40 and I was hearing her voice in my head telling me negative things. And it finally dawned on me, dang it, I'm the one playing that play button. And I'm the one that's turning that on. She's not here to turn it on. So we allow the egoic mind to play those tapes to keep us in a state of fear so we don't move forward, so we don't take the healing journey, so we don't grow and expand and become who we authentically are. Now, I went through a period of a long time where I thought I was broken. I thought my innocence was stolen from me. All these negative connotations that the egoic mind puts upon you to keep you in place so you don't do anything that could be potentially risk. So, but I realized I wasn't broken. I was always whole. And part of me, as you noticed, I had to have been whole to be able to get us out of that situation. I had to be whole in order to realize that I can switch from being a victim and becoming a survivor. Broken people don't do that. Whole people do. And we're all whole. We never are broken. We may get cracked. We may get crushed, but we're always whole. And I didn't need to be fixed. What I needed to do was take off the masks and armor that I put on as defense mechanisms, which were absolutely natural, needed to happen so that my 11-year-old, 12, 15, 18-year-old self could figure out how to deal with moving through society, growing up and figuring out, okay, do I like sex or do I not like sex? And, how do I feel about this being touched thing? And as you go through that healing journey, you put on what I call the thorny blanket. And, when trauma occurs, we wrap ourselves up and we try to stay away from everybody and we try to, self-comfort. And what we don't realize is that this blanket has thorns in it. And as you start healing and it's time to take off the thorny blanket, it's time to remove the mask, it's time to remove the armor. It's painful because now you have open wounds that had been festering and didn't see the light of day, and now they're healing. And the healing process is slightly uncomfortable. If you cut your finger, it bleeds, then it scabs over, and then it could get itchy. So healing is a process, and it's not necessarily what happens if that cut gets infected. Now it's oozing and all kinds of bad things are happening. So you have to be able to understand that the healing process is a journey. There is going to be ooziness, there's going to be messiness, and that is just part of the process. And you'll get to the other side, because when you cut your finger, it always heals. And dang, don't those paper cuts hurt? Paper cuts are one of the most painful things. But they always heal, and they heal quickly. And if we allow ourselves to take off the thorny blanket and move through that discomfort of the healing process, we come out stronger on the other side. And then we realize I was always whole. I was never broken. I just masked up. I armored up, and people couldn't see who I authentically was. But who I authentically was is always there, even if I cover it up.
Yeah, that's a beautiful description. I love the way that the visual picture that you drew for that. And I've heard of the wet blankets, I've heard of the brick walls, I've heard of the onions. I like the thorny blanket. That resonates greatly with me. And you're right, it does. The pruning process is very painful. And I fear that a lot of my audience is afraid to take that step, because reliving that pain, that's the fear. What kind of advice would you give to somebody to go back and visit that, to get over that first initial step so that they can uncover it and begin their healing journey?
Okay, so I absolutely disagree with that statement. It is a lie of the ego that when you take off the thorny blanket, that you have to relive anything. Okay. Because the reality is, when you take off the thorny blanket, that is the first step in you recognizing that your past does not affect your present or your future. Okay.
Mhm.
So the past is the past. It may have sucked. It may have caused great problems in your past. But today, you're retaking the power by taking off the thorny blanket and choosing to move forward and not look backward. The thorny blanket and that process that you are healing through isn't necessarily about the past. It's about the fact that the defense mechanisms you had in place meant that your programming wasn't updated with new programming. So your version, you're still working on 2.0 where you should be on 4.0, and you have to get through 3.0 to get to 4.0. So that's what those open wounds are. Now, what I mean by that is when somebody has an open wound and somebody comes up and is rubbing your back, I'm like, ouch, that hurts. Well, just like a bruise or an open wound, it hurts, but it's completely different than the pain you suffered when you were going through your trauma. And that different pain is what causes us to put the thorny blanket back on, because that thorny blanket, even though it's painful, it's familiar. We know what that pain feels like. We're okay with what this feels like because we're used to it. But that new pain, we don't know how to deal with it yet. And walking through that is that really what the healing process is making sure that as you go through each of those things that you're unfamiliar with what a true loving relationship looks like. You're unfamiliar with setting personal boundaries and understanding that that's an act of self-care, not a hindrance to somebody else, or that making sure that those personal boundaries mean that you are showing people how to treat you instead of letting them figure out how to deal with you. So those are what I mean by the thorns and open wounds, is that we have to learn to then upgrade our programming, because my programming stuck with an 11-year-old mindset until I was 18. And an 11-year-old can't communicate at 18 the way they should if they're still concerned about the 11-year-old mindset. Right. I had to do a software upgrade. And then as you go through life, we're always growing and progressing and developing. And if we're not, then there's something completely else that we're not dealing with. That you're stuck in the past. And most likely, if you're not growing and developing, you're depressed. Because depression to me is being stuck in the past and looking at the past. Anxiety is the exact opposite, looking at the future and always concerned about the future, which means you miss out living in the present. And the present moment is where everything happens. The future, nothing happens because you haven't gotten there. The past is already done. You can't change anything there. So you must choose to live in the present moment. And in the present moment is where you find love. It's where you find support. It's where you find compassion. It's where you find your empowerment. It's where you find everything you need for the next moment, you find in the present moment. But if you are concerned about the future or living in the past, you don't live in the present, and you don't actually make any progress to what it is you want in the future because you're not looking in the right direction.
That's beautiful. I love that. You've done such a beautiful job communicating that. And I thank you for that explanation. And I know that's going to resonate. I have one friend in mind that needs to hear this podcast because we have talked at length, similar story with the sexual abuse at a young age, and so much pain, so much depression, so much just hurt, and just reliving it over and over again. And the power of now being in the present and processing it so we can be on that healing journey is so powerful. And you've explained it in such a beautiful way. So for our listeners or viewers out there, you can connect with Terri. We're going to put her links in the description. Get her book. She has this beautiful story. And if you'd like to connect with her, click on the links in the description. If you know anybody that would resonate with her story, please share this video with them. And thank you for joining us. And remember, it's all a matter of the heart.